Today we're going to look into one of the most exciting themes in the global market right now, health and longevity. More specifically, the rise of GLP-1 drugs for weight loss and diabetes treatment. Companies like Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly have become poster children for this megatrend with their blockbuster drugs Wegovy and Ozempic capturing headlines, reshaping healthcare, and even influencing consumer sectors like food and beverage. Now, the big question is, has Novo Nordisk already peaked after its explosive run? If you just take a look at Novo Nordisk in the charts, you can see we've had this huge run higher, and now we've had this big drop lower. Is that kind of the end of the upside? Now, let's dig into the seasonal data, the sector context and fundamentals to build a more complete picture of what's going on here. Now, if we look at Novo Nordisk and we look at the seasonal patterns over the last 10 years, what we can see is that the strongest months of the year are March, April, May, and June collectively. Now, this period has consistently driven strong returns, even more so than the winter months. So we can see there's a strong contrast here. From the middle of March through to early June, we have an average return of over 10% in the stock. But then when we go into Q4, and if we look from the start of October into the end of the year, we can see the average return is less than half of that spring return at just under 4%. We also can see a very volatile period in the summer. Although August tends to be the strongest month of the year for Novo Nordisk, if we look from the end of July into early August, we can see there's a 90% losing trade percentage, average return of 6.58%. And that dip that we see in stocks is supported by an equally or greater rise of 8.23%. So the main sort of takeaway is that the spring period is the strongest time of year for Novo Nordisk stock. Now, if we compare this to Euro Stoxx 50, now Novo Nordisk is the largest component of the OMX Copenhagen 25, and also it is a heavyweight stock for the Euro Stoxx 50. Now, the Euro Stoxx 50 typically finds strength later in the year, particularly Q4. So you can see that Euro Stoxx 50 tends to gain in the fourth quarter, whereas Novo Nordisk tends to peak earlier in the spring season. So that divergence just highlights how company-specific drivers like blockbuster drug launches can shape seasonality differently from the broader index. Also, if we look at the healthcare sector more broadly, and if we look at the healthcare sector for the S&P 500, this is the ETF for that group of stocks that focuses on healthcare for the S&P 500, we can see that this sector tends to perform better in the summer months. From June, July, August, that tends to be the strongest period for this sector. So while both Novo and the sector show strength, the important takeaway is that the seasonal peaks for Novo Nordisk come earlier in the year, typically around this spring season, and not as strong in the area we typically associate with equity market strength overall, which is the Q4. Now, on the fundamental side, Novo Nordisk is facing a definite challenge and potential turning point. While its GLP-1 drugs have delivered blockbuster sales, the company has cut its growth outlook several times this year after losing market share in the US obesity market to rival Eli Lilly. It's also struggling to fend off cheaper copycat versions of its drugs from compounding pharmacies. And earlier this month, in the month of September, Novo announced 9,000 job cuts, more than half in Denmark. So that sort of broader risk for Novo Nordisk means that the dominance Novo Nordisk has experienced, making it a national champion in Denmark, is also a systemic exposure potentially for Denmark's economy. And pharmaceutical production and exports remain a key driver of growth. And the central bank in Denmark still see a brighter outlook than the government, projecting around 2% growth in 2025. But it also just highlights how dependent both investors and the Danish economy has become on Novo Nordisk's success. So while the growth story is compelling, it isn't without risk. You can see competition from Eli is intensifying, valuation remains stretched, companies compared to peers, and policy risks around US drug pricing do linger on. And there's also potential macro spillovers, how a single company's fortune can ripple across a whole national economy. So to sum up, we can also look at the technicals, that there's this longer term trend line on the weekly chart, which is containing price. And if we drop up to the monthly chart, we can see we're starting to form into a fairly strong basing area where we have the 100 and 200 exponential moving average, which is containing price for now. So it could be worth looking to see if price starts to find a base around this area. And looking at the seasonality, we do notice there is another pocket of seasonal strength from mid-November into mid-December. You can see an average return of 6.13%. So that could be a very interesting area of potential gains. If we can see a break of that trend line on the weekly chart, that could offer a short-term opportunity to the upside. Also, more broadly, we can see that the strongest period of the year for Novo Nordisk comes in that spring, March, April, May, June window. We've got this average return of 9.53%. So, as always, while nobody can predict the future, using an extensive database, whether that's seasonality, fundamentals, or sector dynamics, or combining them, or just using seasonality on its own, it does help us make more informed decisions in today's turbulent capital markets. Remember, don't just trade it, season exit.